Okay, hello and welcome everybody to this week's special edition of our What's New Embodia webinar as part of our Let's Talk Pelvic Health series. I'm your host, Kristen Lee, Embodia's Customer Success and Marketing Coordinator. I'll be getting us started with housekeeping and leaderboard info, and then I'll be back at the end for questions and wrapping up. And joining us today is our esteemed guest, Rochenda Howard, to talk about how Pilates can complement your pelvic health practice, and Maggie Bergeron, Embodia's co-founder, who's going to tell us all about how you can use Clinic Academy on Embodia and why you might want to. Now, today you're joining us for our 4th of 10 value pack sessions as part of our Let's Talk Pelvic Health series, continuing from now until mid-November. As you can see, we've got lots of great topics lined up for you for the remainder of this free series, so you may make sure that you don't miss out. Since Embodia is now also a CEU approved provider for PTs and PTAs in 34 of the US states plus the Virgin Islands, we're able to offer half a CEU for this session today, corresponding with Rochenda's presentation. We'll have more information for you on that in the webinar follow-up email. Now, for those of you that are a little less familiar with Embodia, I'm just going to go over some quick information first. Embodia is an all-in-one practice solution offering a complete practice management system with built-in HEP, including a growing library of over 3,500 exercise videos, billing and reporting, charting, scheduling and online booking, outcome measures and questionnaires, tele-rehab, practitioner continuing education, and more. Plus, you have the option to add Clinic Academy to any membership, which is your own branded platform that lets you grow your bottom line and generate passive income by creating and selling courses to your community. This is what Maggie's going to be going into further detail about today. And for the leaderboard info I mentioned, in case there's some of you where this is your first session, or just as a refresher, I'm going to make sure I go over this so everybody's on the same page. It's completely optional to join, but the prizes are usually worth hundreds, so you may as well. There's a QR code on the next 2 pages to join, and when you do, just make sure you use your full name that matches your Embodia account so that we can make sure that we link you up with your prizes. On the bottom right, you'll see ways that you can earn. So just for attending live today, you get 3 points right off the hop. If you share on social media and tag both the instructor, Rochenda, and Embodia, you're going to get 2 points, and then 1 point for every question that you ask as well. So get thinking. We tally the points after each webinar, and then we announce the winner during the following webinar. And on that note, oh no, my computer's slow. Congratulations to Audra. You've won a seat to Mike Stewart's 2-day live course, a practical guide for persistent pain therapy. This includes 16 hours of live interactive class on working with persistent pain. We'll be in touch after the webinar for a little bit more information about your prize and how to claim it. And for this week, up for grabs, we've got Shelley Prosco's resource package, Physio Yoga and the Pelvic Floor. This includes 6 full hours worth of a variety of guided video and audio pelvic practices to share with your patients. Just a small note, while anyone can access and learn from this resource package, in order to share the material directly with your patients, you'll need to use Embodia's built-in HEP feature, which requires a tier 2 or 3 membership. And lastly, if you have any questions at any point during this webinar, you can put them in the Q&A section down below, and we'll get to them during or after our talk. And remember that each question you earn 1 point for. As well, we have a couple polls running, so feel free to add your answers as we go along here. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass the mic off to Rochenda.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you to Maggie and Embodia for inviting me to this webinar and your community of pelvic health specialists, which I am not, but I'm honored to share my passion and my work and introduce you to a Pilates-informed approach to the pelvis and in pregnancy. And I love working with Maggie, and I thank you, Maggie, for all the years of awesome tech support that you provided to enhance my clinical practice and the teaching and education side of my work. Next slide. So a little bit about me. I'm a physiotherapist. I've been working for 40 years, which I'm proud to say, but I'm a little alarmed to say. And 30 of those years have been in the Pilates space. And I was literally thrown into the back room of a British physio's practice in Hong Kong with the instructions that this exercise technician, that woman standing on the left there, is on to something and figure it out. And at that time, 30 years ago, Pilates was not a household name. But in that room, I found Julia working with the Hong Kong Ballet. Some were injured and some were not. And I found that environment super overwhelming with what she was doing with the dancers and how she was working. But I realized then the major gap in a physiotherapist's approach, or at least my approach to exercise and rehabilitation, and that I was missing out on the complexities of muscle and movement. So it's safe to say that my career as an orthomanual therapist literally changed direction overnight. And I've been immersed exclusively in Pilates ever since, with the privilege of working extensively with Julia Ellis as an apprentice under her, and then later as a business partner with her to develop a physio Pilates system, later formalized into a training series to train colleagues in our clinics in Hong Kong and elsewhere in this system. And concurrently, I've operated a physio Pilates studio in Hong Kong from 1993 to 2010, and now on a smaller scale in Toronto since 2011. Next slide. So a little bit, who is Joseph Pilates? He was a German-born athlete who during World War I interned in the UK with other German nationals. And he developed a series of mat exercises at that time that were based on his ideas of Eastern and Western exercise training disciplines. Later, he worked as a wartime orderly in a hospital on the Isle of Man, and he took these mat exercises and experimented with simple slings and springs and pulley systems attached to a bed frame so that bedridden patients could exercise. So this led to the development of some of the apparatus, such as you might see behind me here in my studio, that's used today in Pilates. And so this was quite revolutionary at the time because this was long before the benefits of early mobility were recognized. Next. So after the war, Pilates emigrated to America. And in 1926, he founded a studio in New York, and he developed a loyal following there within the dance community. He worked with George Balanchine of classical dance renown, and he worked with Martha Graham of modern dance renown. And his interest in this time was always movement and the control of the mind over movement. So his method, which he called controlology, later spread in the dance communities in the UK and Europe. But as you know, it's since been discovered by many other people, including myself, physiotherapists, and regular people. Now, what I want you to appreciate on this slide depicting the pelvis, I want you to appreciate that central to Pilates thinking is that the foundation of the body is in the pelvis. And Joseph Pilates called it the primary powerhouse. So in Pilates, we talk about a center, and the balance of the body and the control of posture is found in its center, and that's the pelvis. Next. The function of the pelvis, as we know, is to transfer the load generated by the body weight and the forces of gravity. And it can be argued that it does this best if the pelvis is supported in its anatomical neutral position. Next slide. So the neutral posture of the pelvis in Pilates is very important because it doesn't only determine efficient load transfer, but it's a reflection of the neuromuscular and the biomechanical state of the entire body. And everything else is layered and balanced on top of this center. It should be noted that Pilates himself didn't have the same focus on neutral, but physiotherapists have had some input in the Pilates world, and many current Pilates approaches will embrace this neutral pelvis position and how important it is. So pregnancy, of course, throws off the pelvis and throws off the body's center, as depicted somewhat in this Salvador Dali Space Venus art piece. Next slide. So the center is affected by one, the uterus, of course, shifts forward. So there's a change in the center of gravity, which moves posteriorly. And then also the release of the relaxin hormone, causing the ligaments of the pelvis to relax, which allows more space in the pelvis to accommodate the baby. So both these changes will make the pelvis inherently unstable and more susceptible to alignment changes. Next slide. The changes in alignment during pregnancy have been reported in the literature to lead to pelvic pain. And Condor et al. In their systematic review reported that 56% of women would experience pelvic pain during pregnancy. It can lead to sacroiliac joint or pubic symphysis instability, which can cause pain. It can affect the urethra closure and lead to stress incontinence, the changes in alignment. So all of these things, of course, will reduce the quality of life of the woman. Next slide. Marino and colleagues in 2019 studied the changes and measured the biomechanical changes in the pelvis. And they looked at 201 women, and they measured the pelvic alignment at 12, 24, 30, and 36 weeks and 1 month postpartum. And what they found was that there was an AP sagittal tilt that progressively increased during pregnancy. And Condor reports that this was especially apparent from 12 to 36 weeks. They also measured an increase significantly in the anterior width of the pelvis, that this change in the anterior width of the pelvis, which widened, didn't recover simultaneously with the posterior width increases and the AP width increases. So any of these pelvic dysfunctions developed during pregnancy or that recover asymmetrically postpartum can also continue long term. If the pelvis is out of alignment from the neutral position, there will be neuromuscular adaptation and an alteration in the kinematics around the trunk and the hip, and with often long-lasting impacts on posture control, on movement, and on function. And I see this a lot in my clinic during pregnancy, but also postpartum, and sometimes many years postpartum. So to treat the symptoms of pelvic pain, pelvic instability, or stress incontinence, I will choose to treat the biomechanical changes in alignment and neuromuscular function. So I get referrals or self-referrals for women during pregnancy or postpartum to deal with these symptoms. And as you can imagine, the Pilates approach does offer a unique lens into the pelvis and exercise. The BET Physio-Pilates approach offers a technical and a scientifically based approach, somewhat different than traditional Pilates, especially when it comes to my preferred way to address the pelvic dysfunctions that I see related to pregnancy. And I want to open your eyes a bit to the role of the lower distal glute max in this. And I'll elaborate on that a bit later. But next slide. First, I want to divert briefly to some foundational BET Physio-Pilates theory to start to highlight why we cannot just give this person basic squats and bridges to train the gluteals. So if we look into the literature, and we can look, and there are two mechanisms that are proposed that can change muscle function and pelvic stability. So if we look first of all at mechanical mechanisms impacting on neuromuscular function, and this has been developed and addressed by Kendall and developed on by Sarman, and they talk about postural changes to the pelvis, such as a sustained anterior pelvic tilt that's been reported in pregnancy. This can lead to changes in the relative length tension relationship of muscles around the pelvis, with some muscles routinely becoming lengthened and therefore functionally weakened, and some muscles becoming shortened and therefore strengthened. From a totally different framework, we can look to neurological mechanisms that might impact on neuromuscular function. And this has been studied a lot in the Australian literature. And they talk about and show that pain, such as sacroiliac joint pain that we see in pregnancy, or trauma, such as a fall, and Condor and colleagues reported that 27% of women experience falls during pregnancy, especially in the last trimester. So these two things can lead to a change in motor unit recruitment of muscles around the pelvis, with some muscles routinely becoming facilitated and more active, and some muscles becoming routinely inhibited and less active around the pelvis. Next slide. So this will impact on the two key points of muscle control in the pelvis that we focus on in Pilates, and the strategies used in layering these muscles for load transfer and movement through the pelvis. So anteriorly, the pelvis is supported by an abdominal layering strategy, building out from the deeper lower abdominals, and posteriorly by a gluteal layering strategy, building out from the deeper lower gluteals. The diaphragm and the pelvic floor support both the anterior and the posterior strategies. Next slide. If we go and look specifically at mechanical mechanisms in a pregnant woman, so there's a reported AP tilt of the pelvis. So of course, all the layers of the abdominal muscles will lengthen and shift to the right on the length tension curve, thereby functionally weakening the abdominals, and perhaps more than they would just from the pressure of the uterus and the stretch on the abdominals from that force. So the abdominals, as the pregnancy advances, become less helpful in maintaining a stable pelvis. And therefore, the sacroiliac joints or the lumbar spine joints can get overloaded. The lower gluteals are also affected by length tension changes and the change in the position of the pelvis. So if the pelvis goes into an anterior pelvic tilt and it widens posteriorly, this will posturally lengthen the lower gluteal muscles and make them functionally weaker. Next slide. If we look from the other framework and we look at neurological mechanisms, once there's pain in the pelvis, for example, in the sacroiliac joint, as is in pregnancy often, we will get a change in motor unit recruitment and in the brain to nerve to muscle link. And this will impact at a key point of muscle control in the pelvis, and posteriorly, this is the gluteals. Next slide. So I want to highlight this in a research study that we ran where we looked at subjects with low back pain, chronic low back pain. They weren't pregnant, but they did have pain. And if we look at this EMG trace, the upper is the superior glute max, the lower is the mid is inferior glute max, and the lower is the hamstrings. And we're looking at the onset and magnitude of these muscles. And we can see in this prone leg extension task that was studied that this low back pain subject initiated the hip extension with their hamstrings, which stayed fairly active through the movement. There was a later onset of the upper glute max and no activity coming from the inferior glutes. So this is a very dysfunctional hip extension strategy that would contribute to their pain, and it's effectively hip compression. There's no real true hip extension here. Now, published research to date does not differentiate the lower glute max and the upper glute max in this way, but we do know that, and we were able to show that there is a differentiation between the two muscles. And this is really important in our treatment approach, which I'll highlight later. Next slide. Now, there is increasing evidence that these altered neural control strategies that we showed in our research is not just happening at the neuromuscular level, but it's more recently being shown in the literature that it's related to central mechanisms and a function of neuroplasticity. So there's a change in the brain structure and function and a central reorganization and a change in the cortical representation of particular muscles in the brain with some overlap and loss of differentiation. And so this is really important to keep in mind, this central reorganization in the somatosensory and the motor cortex. And we're effectively going to try to train both of those. Next slide. So in keeping with all this theory and all this research in mind, when I'm in the treatment phase in my clinic, my approach with an anterior-posterior postured pelvis or a pelvis that's out of alignment, keeping in mind the pregnancy-related necessary changes in the abdominals, I'm going to target the deeper lower glute max. And as you saw on the EMG traces, there is a pain-related neural inhibition of the distal gluteals, both gluteals, but the distal gluteals particularly. And I see this clinically all the time with pregnant women in my clinic. And I'm going to train those lower gluteals to act like a sling underneath the pelvis to literally prop up the pelvis and to help position it closer to the neutral position. And then secondly, to center the femur in the acetabulum. And you can see here on these anatomy drawings that there is a differentiation anatomically in the upper fibers and the lower fibers of the glute max, with the upper fibers running more diagonally and the lower fibers running more horizontally. Next slide. And I really love the anatomy cadavers that, if you've ever seen Body Vital, and this has a really, the Body Vital show really showed the gluteals quite well. And you can see on this slide the different attachment of the distal fibers of the glute max. It attaches separately onto the gluteal tuberosity, whereas the upper fibers attach onto the iliotibial band. So that gives it the opportunity to have a separate role, particularly on the femur. Next slide. So if we go into a Pilates environment to try to address this pain and alignment changes, traditional Pilates exercise doesn't necessarily work by default. If the pelvis is out of alignment, or if there is pain and neural inhibition, then our patient might just pull into their faulty pattern and use faulty muscles and perpetuate the pain and perpetuate the instability. So it's how the muscle is trained in this environment that makes the difference. It's very process driven, I would have to say. Next slide. So if we're going to address this by cortico-neuromuscular reeducation in order to impact initially the lower gluteal, the first step is isolation of the lower gluteal from all other muscles. So we're going to consider the specific function of the lower gluteals. It extends the hip, of course, like the upper glute max does, but most significant, it distracts and externally rotates the hip and does some adduction. So it is basically the dancer's turnout muscle. And we're going to use this capacity of the muscle to program its ability to stabilize the pelvis. Next slide. So the amount of cueing and feedback that is needed for this is very, very important. And we use a lot of rich feedback. We use a lot of manual facilitation to try to get that distal glute max to produce some EMG. We do a lot of tactile neuro facilitation techniques, similar to how neurotherapists might work, a lot of visual input, a lot of auditory input. And you'll see in this slide, I've got the EMG biofeedback on the motor point of the distal glute max, and I'm training this client how to activate that muscle and to use that muscle to produce movement. Next slide. We also want to consider the properties of the type 1 muscle fiber type and how they train, because this neural inhibition, pain inhibition, tends to impact on muscles that are comprised of a high proportion of type 1 muscle fiber type versus type 2 phasic. And these muscles respond best to an isometric load, eccentric loading, deceleration of the movement. They work best when possible in a closed kinetic chain loading. They have a very low threshold for recruitment, so I ask the client to work at no more than 30% of a maximum voluntary contraction. They work very slowly. Next slide. They work with no fatigue so that they can sustain that muscle activation. Always best when trained at the physiological resting length, so that the optimal length tension relationship of the muscle is preserved. So that happens to be neutral pelvis. And then we always want to be reducing the influence of antagonistic muscles such as hamstrings, like we saw on the EMG. Next slide. So part of our cueing, and this is very unique to Pilates, is using a lot of imagery. And the use of imagery is very, very powerful at the cerebral level. Imagery was developed in the dance world, and Eric Franklin is the guru of imagery. And so the use of imagery has been transferred to Pilates, since Pilates is basically based on dance. So we never want to think of the muscle tightening or squeezing or contracting. We want to think about things like ribbons and balloons and sandprints and buttons. And that's a way to tap into the brain. And to note, these images will always imply movement of some sort, movement of the muscle that we're targeting or movement of the limb. Next slide. So after training the activation of the lower gluteal muscle, I'm going to now add this to simple movement patterns to load the muscle, but also to challenge control of the neutral pelvis. So this is a classic Pilates exercise, and we're training the patient to use the lower gluteal to prop up the leg and to isolate the movement of the leg on the pelvis with no movement of the pelvis. So this implies good lower gluteal function. And this is something I would do with a pregnant woman, even obviously he's not pregnant. Next slide. I can add now some spring resistance from the trapeze table, and this will make the movement easier. It closes up the kinetic chain, and it also helps give some cueing to the muscle. So this client here is learning to use her distal lower gluteal to support the leg in the socket and to move the leg on the pelvis without moving the pelvis. Still inside lying, a really good position for a pregnant woman. These are more movements. You'll see the top slide. Our model here is doing a clam, but it's a very sort of dance-like clam exercise. Basically, all our patients are doing ballet bar lying on the mat and training the lower gluteal to act like a dancer's turnout muscle using a lot of imagery. On the next slide, we can see I've now added a spring resistance to do this retire movement and position. And this makes it a little bit easier to cue into the muscle. Next slide. I can also put our patient on the reformer and teach hip extension strategies, moving from the lower gluteal and down the kinetic chain. And against the resistance of the reformer as she pushes out on that bar, the spring is resisting some of the movement of the carriage in and out. And I wanted to take you briefly to how I would work with a patient in the clinic. And hopefully this will come up, Maggie, where I'm going to go on to my Embodia app.
Yeah, just give me one moment. And I think we had like a bit of an issue with the slide lineup, but let's see if we can get this to work here. Okay. Link. It's probably because it's on your account. I don't know if we'll be able to.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay, so back
Okay.
to slides and just have a look here to make sure we're on the right one.
So we're on the https://embodia.com.
Yeah, it's here.
Okay. You're on that?
Yeah, and now we're on muscles work and synergy.
Okay. Okay, so what I was going to show there previously was how I would work with a client in the clinic, where I would use, for example, a clam exercise and teach the specific activation and control from the lower gluteal to use that exercise to do that movement, and the amount of cueing and feedback that's needed to produce the correct movement. And that's my treatment in the clinic. I may or may not prescribe that as a home exercise for the patient to practice with at home. If I do, then I will use the totally awesome Embodia app with a video of me teaching a model how to do that movement correctly. And then the patients just love it and they follow along with the video clip. And because how it's done is so important, they find this very helpful.
And maybe what we can do is we can share the video, like a sample of the video you were going to show afterwards.
Sure, sure. Okay. So once we've worked on isolation of the muscle and simple movements produced by the muscle, a really important concept is that this muscle always works in synergy and in movement. So we're going to build that out from those simpler movement patterns of a clam, for example, and systematically build it into a more dynamic postures and movement. And we're always working in kinetic chains down the lower kinetic chain. So on this next slide, you will see a client working on the reformer. And you can see, if you can look on her left buttock there, I have an EMG biofeedback on the lower gluteal. So she's getting some feedback on how well that lower gluteal is supporting the leg under the pelvis. And then as she moves the carriage in and out with her leg under the spring resistance, she's challenging the neutral control of the pelvis and the control there. And on this next slide, turning around, still stabilizing on that standing leg with the lower gluteal, and then using the right lower gluteal to move the carriage behind her, trying to produce a more effective hip extension strategy. Next slide. So Pilates exercise therapy then can be considered to be very cognition targeted. And keeping in mind the principles of motor learning, keeping in mind that we are actually training the brain. So Pilates himself said that controlology, which is what he called his system, reawakens thousands and thousands of dormant brain cells. Next slide. And that it is the mind itself, that's Pilates there, it's the mind itself which shapes the body. And this is only possible secondary to neuroplasticity. So the body will change. and the muscles will change. They're amenable to training. And Pilates knew about this, but he had no science at that time to explain his ideas. And next slide, as you might guess, this is a massively mindful approach. And clients talk about it as being absolutely exhausting, mostly mentally, physically as well, but mostly mentally. So on this next slide, I want to show you that you can have a really good outcome with this cognitive neuromuscular approach. And if we go back to the research that we did and the EMG traces, on the top trace, you see the client, the subject prior to treatment with initiation of the prone hip extension with the hamstrings on the lower EMG, and later participation of the upper glutes and nothing going on in the lower glute, in the inferior glute. Then following the training program, there is activation of both gluteals. The initiation of that hip extension is done with the gluteals, the lower and the upper gluteals around the same time, followed later by the hamstrings. This is a very efficient hip extension strategy where the gluteals control it. This is hip extension. This is not back extension. This is not hip compression. So we can see that we can change neuromuscular recruitment and patterning. Next slide. So in here, so basically what we've done now is we've trained the gluteals to prop up the pelvis and support it in neutral. And it acts like a sling. And in the left upper there, that's my mentor, Julia Ellis, dancing and using her lower gluteal to support her pelvis. And we can see, I mean, this is not her pregnant, but she looked exactly like that pregnant. She is using the gluteals like a sling to move the leg on, where the rest of the body is held up and the lower limbs can stabilize. So the pelvis is the foundation. And this is very important in pregnancy with the load of the baby, but also postpartum with all the loading of childcare. Next slide. So in summary, in pregnant women, the reported mechanical changes to pelvic alignment, which are reported to be an anterior pelvic tilt and posterior and anterior width changes, will affect the tension a muscle is able to generate, where some muscles are lengthened and weakened, for example, the gluteals. In the presence of pain, such as the sacroiliac joint or the pubic symphysis, there'll be a neurological impact with changes in motor unit recruitment, where some muscles are inhibited and weakened, such as the lower gluteals. And this is felt to be and shown to be a central motor control problem. We measured this in our research at the neuromuscular level, but it is a central motor control problem. So the simple and basic exercises, assigning clams and bridges and hope for the best, that might not be the answer. We need to train the music of movement, train the conductor. And in pregnancy, a key focus in my clinic is on the instrument, the lower glute max. I want to re-educate it. I want to use it to restore the neutral posture and increase its type 1 muscle fiber capacity. So this requires a lot of feedback and a lot of practice. And then we're going to take that lower gluteal and work it in synergy with all the other instruments in the orchestra. And if we look at Cahill Gibran's writings, and he writes, your body is the harp of your soul, and it's yours to bring forth sweet music from it or confuse sounds. So I hope I've given you some food for thought and some insight into a Pilates-informed framework that I've found helpful in addressing what is and could be a root cause of pelvic pain, pelvic instability, and incontinence related to pregnancy. Thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rochenda. And we did run your polls while the slides were playing, so I wonder if that just caused a bit of an issue with the slides. I don't know. So apologies
Mm.
to everyone, but we'll make sure everyone can look at them afterwards as well. And if I just go back and look at the poll results, it seemed like for those who do Pilates themselves, the majority said occasionally, and who
Mhm.
does some kind of Pilates work in their clinic, the majority, vast majority said, no, I don't.
Okay,
Wonderful.
interesting.
Um,
Awesome tool.
yeah. Yeah, and I have to say, I've never really done Pilates until now I'm postpartum and I go to a baby and me Pilates class, and it's
Very
way to
good.
connect with baby, and it's been a good introduction to Pilates.
Very good.
Um, Before I jump into my part of the presentation, I wonder if we just want to take a question or two. Would that be okay, Rochenda?
Mhm.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Okay. Um, I'll take this one from Chaya. Considering some women don't like or can't tolerate supine or prone, are most exercises on reformer and side lying?
Sideline is very helpful, obviously, and I showed all the images in Sideline. But you can work if they can't tolerate supine. You can actually prop the patient up on the reformer, so they can be doing a supine hip and knee extension movement, but their torso is propped up, so they're leaning back a little bit. So that's, or putting a ball behind them and they sit against the ball and then push in and out on the reformer foot plate. That's very commonly used in Pilates. They can also work in 4-point usually, and in standing and other postures. Prone, no, don't usually work in prone.
Okay, we have a question that's going to challenge our thinking here. It says, thank you, Rochenda, for your passion in this space. We now know that there's no longer strong evidence that pelvic instability is part of the pregnancy-related pelvic girdle pain dialogue. The pelvis is stable, safe, and manageable, self-manageable, as demonstrated in the paper by Jody Pulsifer, 2022, called Reframing Beliefs and Instilling Facts for Contemporary Management of Pregnancy-Related Pelvic Girdle Pain. How do you reconcile your approach in Pilates with the building evidence that instability is an unhelpful narrative in pregnancy and pelvic girdle pain?
Yeah, I would go more with, and I am focused more on the alignment changes that I see. So with the anterior pelvic tilt, for example, and often rotations and that kind of thing. So I'm not, I'm more focused on trying to get the alignment closer to neutral. But even more importantly is how are the lower gluteals and other muscles in the abdominal cavity supporting the pelvis? So when I'm talking about stability, it's not a ligamentous stability I'm really looking at. It's more how stable is the pelvis throughout movement? Does it move with the leg? Is it stuck to the leg? I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it's a slightly different thought on the definition of stability. But I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to read that paper though, so thanks for sharing that.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to jump into my components. So we're switching gears. There are a few more questions, but for folks who want to stick around, we can come back to those at the end. I am going to switch gears now into talking about Clinic Academy. And I'm going to share my screen and we'll go through that for about 10 minutes. And feel free to continue to use the chat if you'd like to chat with Rochenda. And otherwise, we'll jump into what's called Clinic Academy. So I'm going to go through some of the features and how it's currently used. A Clinic Academy is essentially a way to host your own courses, but for patients and the general public. So this is a step beyond HEP, HEP being prescribing exercises and education to your patients, to courses that patients and the general public can sign up to. And we're looking at an example here of a clinic academy. I named my example Evolve PT Academy. And we can see that there are 2 course tracks in here, and these course tracks have 2 courses each. I'm looking at this from a practitioner standpoint. So this is how I would set up a course if I wanted to go and provide this to my patients. Now, an important note about this is you can provide your courses for free if you wanted. So if you wanted to just add it to your offerings, or what a lot of clinics are doing is setting it up as an additional revenue stream. So one of the challenges as a clinician is that a lot, if not all, of our income is from one-on-one or maybe one-to-some care. And so what some clinicians are now looking to do is, how do I put together maybe some of the things that I would often teach patients into more of a course and have that as passive income? So this is one way that you can do that. This feature is available on Embodia, and if you're interested in like pricing or how that works, we can certainly send you that information, or Kristen could put that in the chat. For now, we'll just do a brief overview. In this track, we can see that there are 2 courses, and they are set up as a fee. Now we're in Canada, so it's in Canadian dollars. If you're outside of Canada, you can list it in US dollars. And each course we can see can have educational lessons, there can be a discussion forum, and there can be preset exercises that are programs. So if you have kind of like maybe intro to breathing, since this is the example I'm showing, you could set up week 1 exercises, week 2 exercises, and so on. And patients would then be able to follow along with those programs on their dashboard. We will also show the patient and the client side in a moment. One of the reasons we're talking about this as well is because we've added 2 new features that are now available in a clinic academy. One of them is that you can host it on your own app, essentially, so your own branded app, and patients can access your courses and they can pay for them through that app. The second is questionnaires, and this is something that we've been asked for regularly within courses, and we have finally added this. So within each course, I'm going to click on this Principles of Pilates. We can see that there's 1 hour of course material, so there's content for the course. Currently, there's no exercises, templates, or questionnaires. If you had questionnaires that were associated with this course that you wanted folks to fill out, you can simply add them. And we'll see this as an example here. So we'll add the DAS. And let's add maybe the CSI. You can also choose if patients are going to fill this out once, or if you want them to fill it out multiple times. So the ability to fill it out more than once, maybe at particular time intervals. Okay, so now we can see this course has 1 hour of course material, 2 questionnaires, and there's also a discussion forum. So this is all available for you in the setup. Under Edit Settings, we can add additional things within the course, such as, in this instance, we have a discussion forum where people participating in this course can ask questions, and you, as the owner of this course, can also respond to those questions. A few other helpful notes about this from a practitioner standpoint before we jump in as a patient. Like I mentioned, you could add exercises, or more common with clinic academies is adding templates. So these would be preset programs. For example, we'll say week 1, pelvic Pilates. And then you can simply add exercises that are already in your library. You can preset the instructions, so it's kind of set it and forget it, and then it'll start within a patient's program. We'll say all done. You can also add education. When we go back to the course page here, now we can see that there's a template. We'll jump into what this looks like from a patient or from just a general public standpoint. So from their standpoint, they can access this on the web like I am here. So I'm on my computer, or if you have it set up as an app, they can also save the app to their phone, and then they'd be able to access everything that we're seeing here from your branded app. Again, in this instance, I called it Evolve PT, but of course you can change this to be your clinic name or your name. You can add text. You can also add images to your patient page here. And the buttons that appear depend on how you're using Embodia and its features. In this instance, I'm also offering appointments, so people could go and find an appointment. They can view our courses, and we also have memberships set up. So memberships is something that can also be set up within your clinic academy. So if you had a lot of content and wanted to offer a membership option, you could say, we have however you'd like to set it up. In this instance, monthly and yearly. And if somebody is on a membership plan, they will get courses for free or maybe a discount on courses. There's a lot of flexibility. So again, this is a simple example. Now, also on the patient side, we can see our logo on the top side, and we can see our sidebar here with all of the various sections. On our dashboard, it's going to be empty right now because we haven't started anything. And we can see our academy. So we have started a course, but let's go and opt into this course. So a patient will have the option to buy a course. Similar to Embodia, if you've used our courses and you have a coupon code, you could also give patients a coupon code to get a discount. And they're given the option to sign up for a membership or just to simply buy the single course. Once they've purchased the course, of course, they can start it. And they'll be able to view all of the material. They can also start their program. So we'll start week 1, which is now going to be added to my dashboard. Just going back into the course here so we can have a look at the questionnaires. If there are questionnaires included, patients can click on them, complete them, and it's a digitally fillable questionnaire. So they can go ahead and fill out their answers. And of course, if we've set it to be filled out more than once, then they're able to complete it more than once. This could also apply for things like diaries. So if you have a fiber diary, pelvic diary, things like that, you can also add those as questionnaires so that they could fill those out on a regular basis. Okay, we got to the end. I'm going to hit submit. They'll be able to see their score. Of course, they may need to, of course, have a discussion with their practitioner in terms of what this means. We can see that we filled it out. And then finally, within the forum, patients can either join a discussion, and when they fill this out, they can post anonymously, and they can also follow the conversation. So if they wanted to get updates when there's new comments left, they can do so. Okay, so that ends our brief tour of a clinic academy. Of course, if you have questions, feel free to let us know, but I'd love to hop back into questions that folks may have who are joining us here. So Kristen, if you want to field or ask those questions, that would be great.
Sure, thanks, Maggie. Can you please share that last slide there for me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. While you're doing that, I can just go ahead and get to as many questions as we can for the remainder. We've got 6 minutes, so that should be good. We'll start with an anonymous question for you, Rochenda. I think all the questions are for you, Rochenda. We've got one. I watched your intro webinar you did previously on Embodia. You said posture is a verb. How does that shift the way you think about posture and movement and rehabilitation?
Yeah, so I talked about posture being a verb in that as physiotherapists, we often have traditionally just thought of posture as a standing up thing that you examine, but that we're looking at posture throughout movement. So if somebody is halfway through a curl, let's say, then we can kind of freeze that and assess the muscle balance, the alignment of the pelvis during that curl. So we're just considering posture as something that moves around with the person and always looking to optimize that posture.
Okay, great.
And particularly the muscles that support it. So that one muscle isn't pulling things out of a good posture, out of a stable posture.
Fantastic. Okay. Our next question is from Jane. I'm new to Pilates, but interested, and there seems to be different frameworks. In what way, different frameworks. In what ways does the BET system address movement imbalances differently than traditional physiotherapy or Pilates only methods?
I think it's in the theoretical framework where we're looking at what are the neurological compromises, what are the mechanical compromises, and then working within that framework to very specifically and technically train certain muscles. It's very heavily based on an assessment. So without assessing the patient, we're not quite sure how we're going to target the physio Pilates treatment. So the Pilates-based approach that we use is very much a melding of traditional Pilates and physiotherapy research and literature and putting those two together. So there's a very, very strong theoretical rationale why we would have someone lying on a reformer pushing in and out in this particular way. There's a theoretical rationale behind every single movement training we do and every single muscle training we do. So I find in that way it's a little different. Also, there's very much a meld of neurophysiotherapy with orthopedic physiotherapy. So it's very familiar to neurotherapists how we're training movement, which as an orthopedic, I used to be a neurophysio, and then when I moved to orthopedics, I found the way of teaching exercise and teaching movement was very different than as I did as a neurotherapist. But if you meld those two together, you can get some very powerful therapeutic exercise. I'm not sure if that answers.
We have a couple minutes left and 2 questions. So one seems like a quick one. Do you need a reformer to do Pilates exercises or can you improvise?
Well, the foundation of Pilates is the mat work. So that's what Joseph Pilates started with. That's what I've used when I've worked in environments that do not have any apparatus. I've used just the mat work. And I sometimes have patients that come in and say, I don't want to come into the studio because I live somewhere else. And I just want to learn what I can do at home myself. So I would say the most powerful part is actually the mat work. That's what does the changes to neuromuscular control is what you do on the mat.
Okay. And last question, do you cue breathing in specific ways during muscular training, or do you allow your clients to breathe or not as they prefer?
I allow them to breathe or not. I allow them to breathe, not. They need to breathe. So that's really important. I just let that happen. However, I do a lot of specific breathing training. And in a Pilates approach, we tend to train the posterior diaphragm. So we do a lot of back rib breathing and a different kind of style of breathing than we might use in other approaches. So if I need to address breathing, I address it from the posterior diaphragm.
Okay, well, that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you very much, Rochenda, for your presentation and all your answers to those very great questions. If you'd like more information about Embodia, you can use the links in the QR code on screen to learn more about membership information and pricing, more courses and webinars, or booking a demo that fits your schedule. And I'd just like to thank everyone for your participation and sticking around, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you very much.